It's interesting, the year I gave up writing is the year that I wrote Death at an Early Age. Suddenly I was doing something that actually tore at my heart and worth writing about. This is, I have kids do, keep a journal. And every night I'd write down what happened that day. And suddenly, around May, my girlfriend said to me, I hate to break the bad news to you, but I think you've written a book. This is my hideout. This is my writing hideout. This house was built in 1740. And whenever people come up here who are a little more, have more money than I do, or a little more conventional, they'll say, the first remark is, you could really do something with this house. Companies like that have this terrible habit of leaving notes on the door saying, you weren't here, we couldn't deliver. And people are always sending me, a lot of teachers send me long, heartfelt writings about the challenges they're facing in the classroom. Or they'll send me a whole thick envelope of letters that their kids wrote to me if I visited their class. And I don't like having to go and all the way back to the airport in Boston to retrieve these things. So I put this here and I sign it. So I figure if they want a signature, they can rip this off. That's the kitchen. I think this was once a woodshed, but it's fine for me. This is all mail that I haven't answered, that I haven't caught up with yet, that's come in the past month, I try. This was once a dining room, but it's been taken over by notes for one of the two books that I'm working on now. Early manuscripts, revisions of my last 10 books, or last 8 books probably. It's not organized at all. You have to just sort of use your intuition to arrive at the right spot if you want to find a book you want. It's not alphabetic or anything. Well, this is the only respectable room in my house. This is the living room. I'm actually not in here all that much because I'm usually working in the back room, which is my office. 6 rooms in this little house. And you'll see the ceilings are very low because I guess when it was built, people weren't as tall as they are now. What do you call those things? High definition. To watch the Red Sox. That's the one thing I do completely for fun is, apart from jogging out in the woods, which I love to do, is to follow the Red Sox. But the Yankees have been destroying them lately, so I've given up on them for a while. So I retired the new TV. Just hang out and read, do research for the work that I'm doing, or just read to relax. I still read a lot of, what's that fancy word, eclectic. It's very eclectic, because on the one hand, I love sort of the traditional canon of literature that I grew up with and learned when I was at Harvard and later at Oxford when I was living in Paris. So I still read a lot of Auden, W.H. Auden. He was at Oxford when I was there. I love Auden. I love Rilke. But only in this translation. If I read it in a different translation, I don't like it as much. And I read a lot of, I'll still go back and immerse myself in books from the civil rights era. This is one of Taylor Branch's volumes on Dr. King. I spend a lot of time reading children's books. I love, when I'm in classrooms often, what happens is the teacher will, I'll look at a book and I'll say, oh, that looks interesting. And the teacher will say to the class, should we Jonathan, they call me Mr. Jonathan usually. Should we let Mr. Jonathan have his own copy of that book? And so they give me a lot of these books. This is a wonderful one, by the way. A sixth grader gave me this book, a little girl in the Bronx. The Giver by Lois Lowry. It's very reminiscent of Orwell, of George Orwell of 1984, but actually I think it's more subtle, less heavy-handed. It's a beautiful book. Actually, adults like this book as much as children do. I just crash out here and lie down. Sometimes I'll literally lie down sometimes, and just grab something at random off the table. And when I need sort of strong nourishment that's not political at all and has nothing to do with all the injustices we face, I'll just go through the Norton Anthology of Poetry. And I particularly like, you see, I mark everything I like. I particularly like the Elizabethan period, and read John Donne for a while, or some of the sonnets of Shakespeare, or Auden. Auden is my modern favorite, I would say. It's Auden and Rilke. Those three poets, to me, are like, I don't know, they're my soul food. I wrote about, in 3 of my last books, I called her Pineapple. That was a nickname. And it was in the South Bronx. I met her when she was in kindergarten. And she's this wonderful little girl. She's this bossy little girl who always used to give me instructions. She's very worried that I live alone and that she always tried to fix me up with her teachers and things like that. She's like my social counselor. She drew that picture for me once. And I asked her, I mean, it's a sun, obviously, but you can't really tell. That was yellow originally. It's faded, I guess. And you can't really tell if it's rising or setting. So I asked her, I said, is that a setting sun or a rising sun? And because her life was very much in doubt at that point, her future, because she was going to what probably was at that time the worst single public school in New York City, possibly the worst elementary school I'd ever seen in 40 years. She had like 7 different teachers in 4th and 5th grade. They kept coming and leaving, quitting. So it was not at all clear whether her sun was rising or setting. I try not to read metaphors into simple things, but I brought the picture back to her, and we sat down. She was maybe 6th grade by now. Did you mean that to be a rising sun or setting sun? And she looked at me real hard, and she said, you decide. And I ended that book saying, I like to think her sun is rising. And indeed, it is rising. Last year, I was invited to a very fine school that she got into, a private school, kind of a fancy school up here in New England. Somebody gave her a scholarship, and I gave the commencement address and handed her diploma. She's now a college student. So I'm very proud of Pineapple. I love her. Maybe not everyone can recognize that face. That's Langston Hughes. And in my first year of teaching in Boston, in 1964-65, I actually was fired at the end of the school year because I read one of his poems to my class. So he sent me that. as my reward. Above him is my daddy. That's my daddy when he was at Harvard Medical School in 1930. Over here is just a bar of music that probably among educators, my closest friend, Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, sent me that when I was gloomy one week. Did you know he was a musician? He's a very good musician, as well as an ordained minister, and also just one of the sweetest friends children have ever had. That's my mom, by the way. Mom and Dad just died. Mom at 103 and Daddy at 102. And when he sent that to me on my mother's 98th birthday, he just was so thoughtful. I don't know how he kept track of all these birthdays and everything, but he just was awfully kind and protective towards me when he saw that I was worried about something.
And this is Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers.
Wonderful Mr. Rogers, yeah. My book award. The only reason I kept that award here is because my mom and dad were very worried about me when I gave up my, when I'd gone to Harvard and then Oxford and then Paris, and when I decided to become a fourth grade teacher in the inner city in Roxbury, that's sort of Boston's version of South Central LA or South Bronx, they were really worried about me because, they thought a former Rhodes Scholar should be doing something magnificent. But I was 26 by then. And at least be the governor of an insignificant state. But instead, I'd heard Dr. King speak, and a lot of young civil rights workers were being beaten up and murdered in the South, and so I just got my little VW and went over and started teaching in Roxbury, and they were kind of worried that I didn't know what I was doing with my life, and but I kept a journal of my first year of teaching, and it was published as Death at an Early Age, and suddenly my daddy forgave me everything. This is the one I like best. That's an honorary degree that I treasure. It's from a school in the Bronx where I gave a commencement address at kindergarten graduation, and they gave me an honorary degree, and as you can see, it says Doctor of Crayons. Never let anyone in this room, so I'm giving you a special exemption. And this is where I've written all my books for about 25 years, 22 years, I guess. And essentially, I write by hand. I've always written by hand on these pads. If it's not this kind of pen and this kind of pad, I just can't do it. And I don't use a computer. I don't like to write with a computer. I don't like anything mechanical getting in between me and the words. I know this just looks crazy, and it's probably best if you don't film the wall in front of me, simply because, or not too close up, because it's got the phone numbers of everybody like I call on the phone in maybe the past 10 years or something. Every time I go on a rampage and I take down, the ones that I know where everything is. Like there's Elie Wiesel is right there. Kids in the Bronx who are now, the kids I knew are now teenagers or young grown-ups. And keep changing their cell numbers, their cell phone numbers, so I have to keep updating them. So I do them on Post-its. And I keep here a photo of my daddy at the age of, that was his 100th birthday. I come in here and I always drink coffee. I drink much too much coffee. It took me years to figure out you could buy a little gadget that actually keeps the cup hot. And I don't answer the phone. I'll never answer the phone while I'm working. I don't have an email at home here. I have a couple of wonderful assistants who run an office for me in Cambridge, and they do that. There's a fax machine here, but it's upstairs in a little hidden place, so I don't look at that for at least the first 7 hours after I wake up. And I don't look at mail. They don't deliver mail here anyway. We have to go to our little post office to get our mail, which is fine with me. And I always like to start by actually writing. So if there's preparatory research that I need to do for that day's writing, I do it the night before. In other words, after a day of writing, I will pull together all the notes that I need for the next day's writing. Because when I start, I don't know, there's something about that, a cup of coffee and a certain mood of silence. It's so peaceful here, you know. And I'll just go straight to work. I tend to have this problem that when I write, sometimes I don't leave enough margin space. I go too close to the margin. Like here's an example. See where so then after 2 hours, 3 hours, I'll reread what I've been doing. There's the beautiful words that child told you. You forgot. So then I have to do all this. Like I'll have like a little line it'll say. And then sometimes on a single page there'll be a whole bunch of those. And fortunately, she cares a lot about these issues, these social issues, the moral issues. So she, God bless her, types everything I do. I don't send anything the night I write it because I'll rewrite everything a zillion times. And then maybe after 3 weeks, I'll send her 60 pages of this gibberish, and she turns it into typescript that people can read, advise me. And it usually takes me about 3 to 5 years to do a book. Reduce it to something that, looks like it looks like a dog chewed it up, as I'll change so much. And we'll go through maybe 5 of those revisions before that section of a book is set in place. Then later, of course, there's fact-checking and research, and all those bottom shelves down there behind me is all the data from my last 2 books. I'm working on 2 books at once right now. I mean, I've never done that before. The one book I'm working on is 25 years among the poorest children in America. What happened to them since, basically. That's it. And all that stuff is all notes for that book. And that's what I'm working on right now here on my desk. And a lot of that stuff is notes for the same book. Sometimes a book starts to write itself. When my father died last year, he died exactly a year ago, and my mom had just died the year before. One at the age of 102, one at the age of 103. My mom had been a social worker, and my dad was a very, very fine neuropsychiatrist, a very fine clinician. By clinician, I mean he wasn't just like an expert who wrote essays on neuroscience, but he had a doctor's bag, and I found it recently. And because I remember he used to, when I was little, he would take me when he examined patients in the wards of the Mass General Hospital or out at McLean, which is a private sanitarium near here where a lot of writers seem to end up. He'd take me with him, and sometimes when I was little, he'd lift me up and plunk me on the patient's bed, right on top of the patient, and put the stethoscopes on my ears. And he'd tell the patient, "Before I examine you, I'm letting my chief assistant do a preliminary exam." Deeply depressed person, pit of terror and depression, would smile. He was good at making people happy and laugh and smile. He's a wonderful doctor. And, I was very close to them. I'm 72, so that was a big chunk of my life, to have them live so long and to remain so close to them. In my father's late years, he developed Alzheimer's. He diagnosed himself. That was his field. Anyway, so I'm writing a memoir of my father's life. It's called Losing My Father One Day at a Time. Because during it was about 15 years from the time that he began to have memory lapses to the time of severe Alzheimer's, and then to the time of his death last year. As strange as it may seem, I got to be closer to him during those years. Felt I got to know him better, in a way, than I'd ever known him before. Because so long as his conversational gifts remained to him, he was still so damn eloquent. Don't make the mistake I made of spending 3 years in Paris thinking that because I had studied writing in good creative writing courses at Harvard, and I had wonderful teachers, don't make the mistake of thinking you can just go and write a book if you've never lived through anything that's worth writing about. I mean, there are an awful lot of novels in which I'm sure most of them never get published, which are basically, they'll write about what it's like to be in a creative writing class. I essentially decided to give up writing when I left Paris and came back to Boston. And the following year I was in the classroom. And it's interesting, the year I gave up writing is the year that I wrote Death at an Early Age, because suddenly I was doing something that actually tore at my heart and worth writing about. I just started keeping a journal, just as I have kids do, keep a journal. And every night I'd write down what happened that day. And suddenly, around May, my girlfriend said to me, I hate to break the bad news to you, but I think you've written a book. And I said, well, it doesn't really have an ending, I don't see it. And then they fired me. And the black parents were very loyal, and they shut down my school, and it helped to spark the civil rights movement in Boston. And so I said thank you to the Boston school system for giving me an ending to my book. And then I'm addicted to writing every single day, but when I'm writing a painful book, it's painful, and I get upset. I mean, I will actually cry sometimes at something that seems like unbearable. Sometimes I feel like I'm, speaking the unspeakable. And there's a Latin expression that I love, ex nihilo nihil fit. It means nothing comes out of nothing. And you just don't get it cheap.